Good morning. Thanks for having me, guys. Very much looking forward to the next 45 minutes or so talking to you. I know it's Vegas, so the first breakout in the morning, I'm glad that a couple of people came, so thank you for that. I'm going to talk about breaking some rules within DevOps, but doing that consciously. And it's a bit controversial. I had to rename my talk a couple of times because I'm from Australia, so there was perhaps a level of word choices in the title originally that didn't make it to the US. But now we're talking about breaking all the DevOps rules. So I'm a DevOps lead for Accenture, and I'm a pretty passionate guy about what I'm doing. And I learned over the years that I started to disagree with myself. And that can make for interesting conversations. But in this case, it's more like I've learned things, and I've started to understand a lot more about what it takes to be successful in large organizations. So if I would talk to an earlier version of myself and DevOps became really cool a few years ago, I would have been very disappointed with myself today. Because I do think that back then I thought I would never allow it to happen. Right? And here's a couple of these examples. Right? So teams have a broken pipeline, and yet they deploy into an environment, and I'm okay with that. Right? We have people that have deployed code with security vulnerabilities. For Christ's sake, like why do you let that happen? Right? Teams are moving away from full-stack team into federated teams. Right? Or they choose manual activities in the cloud. Wasn't the cloud all about automation? Right? And I want to take you on this journey with me. Like, why am I saying this? Like, is this guy crazy? Right? And no one has left the room yet, so hopefully you are interested in that journey. But I think there's good reasons for doing this if you do it consciously. So I've already introduced myself. I do have a blog called Not a Factory Anymore, which very much is a passion project for myself because I don't believe in software factories. I think we have a much more creative job to do. And I did a book about DevOps in the enterprise. So if you like what I'm saying, then feel free to get a copy. So what am I talking about? So the organization that I work with are not necessarily a tech startup. They usually are kind of bigger, larger enterprises. What that means is you tend to have a portfolio of lots of different things, lots of different projects. You have complex contracts with multiple providers. You have infrastructure that is usually hybrid. So there's some cloud in there. There's some on-prem in there. The applications, some of them are custom. There's a mainframe in there occasionally. There's Siebel. There's SAP. All this fun stuff that you don't associate with DevOps. Right? But there's still goodness in applying DevOps practices to those organizations. Because my definition of DevOps is pretty broad. I think DevOps is one of the tools that we have in our toolkit, just like agility and others, that helps organizations get better. And that's what I want them to help with. Now, besides Agile and DevOps, there's another toolkit, which you will hear all about for these few days, which is obviously the Atlassian toolkit. I missed service management in here, which I will also talk about because I had some pretty cool conversations even over the last couple of days of how we can bring this even further. But I will keep referring back to it. You will see a little icon on the slides on what tools are relevant to the topics that I talk about. So what will I cover in the next 40 minutes? So really three things. Right? And you already saw this a little bit in the where I disagree with myself. I'll talk about CD pipelines. And if you're at all interested in DevOps, you would have noticed that CD pipelines basically take 80% of the oxygen. Right? So everyone keeps talking about the pipelines. The only other thing that you hear perhaps about is culture. I'll talk about full-stack teams. I'll talk about the cloud. And then I do talk a little bit about some take-home tips. Because what I really don't enjoy, like when I go to conferences and there's a talk, I want to have something that I can take away. So I'll give you a couple of these things at the end as well. All right, so let's talk about pipelines. So the good intentions for CD pipelines are that they build, deploy, and assess each new version of the code. They create the application, and they provide fast and comprehensive feedback. So far, so good. Like if you've seen pipeline views, something like that will look familiar to you. Now, there's a couple of things in here. When you think about CD pipelines, everything is automated. You stack everything in it. Like we compile the code, we create the environment, we do security tests, we do functional tests, unit tests, you name it. And what I'm trying to tell you is that that works, but not always. Right? And so here are a couple of examples. So you see at the bottom there code analysis. Yeah? Think about security scanning. Now, there's a couple of things that I want you to imagine. You have this CD pipeline, and you're working in a broader environment that has a number of testers. Now, if you're failing a security scan, should you then still deploy into a test environment? Well, I would say yes, because the testers that they're waiting for the code, they're not the one assessing security, they're assessing functionality. So that means you allowing that deployment to go ahead into the test environment allows those testers to find functional problems much earlier than if you wait until your code passes all the other gates. And the goal of CD pipelines was to get fast feedback. So the point here is, I want to get that feedback from these functional testers or my business testers or whatever it is as quickly as possible, and I will prevent that if I be too strict with my CD pipeline, right? Yet another thing, if you have what I call heritage software, some of them would call them legacy, then you have a code set that is pretty large potentially. And running code scans might then take a long time, right? And so perhaps you don't want to put this in the pipeline, but you only check that you've recently run a security test on it. So rather than bundling everything into the pipeline, I like to talk about networks, where we say we have something that runs directly in the pipeline and other things that run outside of the pipeline, but at a schedule. Yeah? So that's code analysis. We can also look at things like unit test, right? So again, the same principle applies here. Like, there's a lot of organizations that look at unit tests as something that they wanted to have more and more of. And again, is that the right thing to do? Because what we want to do is we want to use them if we will frequently execute them. If you're building just individual features and there are certain functionalities that we will only use kind of once or twice, should we invest in that? And that's the thing that you will keep hearing from me, because organizations look at this stuff with an economic lens. Yeah? And that means there needs to be a return on investment for these things. And that is the same for you as a person. Right? What I learned very early on in my career is, if you have to do something once, just do it manually. If you have to do it multiple times, start automating it. And the same thing is true here. Right? You're not getting a badge at the end of the day that you have 1 million unit tests. You get the badge from successfully releasing software, right, with as little flaws as possible. So you need to think about that there as well. And then we get to running tests, right? And ideally, you have a comprehensive test set, and you test every feature comprehensively every time you deploy it. Well, even if you're in the cloud, that could be very, very expensive, because you would have to run, in parallel across 100 instances so that you can actually test your full feature set. So again, we need to look for what do we actually require here, right? And not more is always better. So I really like to get people to think a lot more about this kind of decentralized model of the pipeline, to really think about what is absolutely required for this specific feature set versus what can be run in kind of any other setup. All right, so let's talk about the next thing, which is full stack teams. So the good intention is the most efficient way for DevOps teams to organize with a full stack team that includes people from everywhere, but also includes infrastructure. Now, I don't know whether you've seen this cartoon. I like this one because it explains so much about what I see in organizations. When we talk about full stack teams, the first thing that people did is we have our development team, and now we add a DBA, we add a web admin, we add an infrastructure person, we add a cloud person, and now we have a full stack team. And people were surprised that didn't work, right? And there's a couple of things for that, right? It is very unlikely that a team has a very balanced amount of work across all of this, right? And so what you experience is, if you're a DBA in a team that is a development team and you're used to support 10 teams, and you now go into development team 1, you're either really bored because you're still going to get 1/10 of the work, or you're going to start working for all the other teams anyway. And then when the rest of your team is doing sprint planning, right, you're not really participating because you're going to look for the DBA tasks that's coming from everywhere else. So you're not really a team. You did the exercise in PowerPoint and you moved that person into that team, but it's not a team because they're not actually doing the same thing, right? So I think there's a trick here to worry about what you're trying to achieve rather than to just go what is kind of the simple but wrong answer. There's another thing that I find very confusing when people talk about full stack, because I will be honest, you might have heard about full stack engineers. Yeah, that's a term that people have heard. I've never seen one. right? So, I mean, I hear the term, but like, show me the person that does Java and DB2 and mainframe, and like, if you're working in a large organization, you don't have one monostack of technologies. You have a little bit of everything. And that means you really don't have full-stack engineers. You have engineers that know a little bit more, and they have like pie-shaped and comb-shaped and those, but you don't have full-stack. And I really don't think we ever thought that full-stack was the right thing to do, because even those people who have full-stack, which is very often startups and new technology teams that have just like the new digital team or whatever, let me argue with you that even they are not full-stack. So think about it this way. There are these agile teams, and whether you have them in with SAFe or less or any kind of other agile methodology, you have agile teams, right? Fine. They're the ones who build functionality. At the bottom, even the people who would say they're full stack, they very likely have cloud servers underneath. They are not stacking the infrastructure, the service in the data center. Now, that was never a definition of full stack. That means there's someone somewhere that's providing services to them. And is that different to if you in your organization have an infra services team, as long as they're providing it in a way to the teams that it's seamless? Right? Like Amazon and Microsoft and so forth have just been really, really good in providing infra services in a way that teams want to consume them, rather than having to go through lots of tickets and the usual stuff that you have to go through. So if your organization can provide it in that same way, there's nothing wrong with it. And then on top of that, you build your org-specific DevOps services. And again, that is not terribly different to what you would consume from any of the cloud service providers. It is in the way that you've built it. They build it as a product, while in many organizations, these things have been built in a way that it's like really hard to get. This is kind of the opposite. Yeah? Those vendors want you to use it. They make it easy. In your organization, it might be like in many of the ones that I've encountered, where there's like barriers of tickets and approvals and business cases to get something. That's what you need to worry about. So it was never about full stack. It was always about being able to do what I need to do in my team as seamless as possible. And that's different. Yeah? So it's always kind of thinking about what you're trying to achieve rather than just running for the obvious answer. And then, this bottom thing, you can call it DevOps platform team. Nowadays, we talk about platform engineering. In 3 months, we will name it something else. But the principles are always the same. You want to enable these agile teams at the top to be as independent as possible, as autonomous as possible. Yeah, so that they can build the products they want to build and not have to worry about how to put infrastructure in case or how to worry about security or any of those kind of things. Right? And then at some stage, if you're doing this long enough, you might get to a distributed model, right? Where you can call it a DevOps tribe. You don't really have teams anymore, but we spread it out across the teams. That all sounded depressing because we all want to be full stack and cool and unicorn. But I can tell you a way of getting closer to that. So if you want to create autonomous teams, these are kind of the 3 steps that I like to use. Right? So the very first thing is you make information available. So one of the most frustrating things is if you're working in a team and you can't get access to the log files or the servers or any of those kind of things. So make that stuff available to the agile teams. They should absolutely have the right to see what's happening on the server. They shouldn't be able to change it, but they should have the rights to see it all. Yeah? Then provide self-service for the obvious things. Resetting passwords, setting up servers, refreshing data, all those kind of things are obvious services to automate. And then provide it as self-service. And then start looking for dependencies. So if you are at all using Jira, service management, any of those kind of things, you have a means of figuring out whether the team is autonomous or not. Because every ticket that they create against another team is a dependency. And that gives you a measure of how autonomous you are. So you can actually look for what is the most common ticket that goes outside of their team, and you can eradicate that, either through process redesign, through automation, through whatever means. And so you have a pretty measurable way of how you're going to get better at becoming autonomous. Now, but is your team ready to be fully autonomous? So I have a 6-year-old at home, and I want my 6-year-old at some stage to be a full-grown adult, very responsible, etc. But if I send him into the kitchen right now and say, go eat something healthy, he is going to go straight for the cookie jar. Right? He's not going to make a salad or any of those kind of things. He's going to go for the thing that's not necessarily good for him. And it could even be bad that he goes for something shiny that is, unfortunately, the dishwashing liquid. Right? I don't want that. And I think we've done a disservice to so many of our teams by walking in and saying, and now you're autonomous. Right? Like, I was there when Agile started, when Agile coaches came in and said, and now you're an autonomous team. They have, for many, many years, not necessarily worried about security or infrastructure, any of those kind of things. What we told these teams is to all of a sudden worry about stuff that they just didn't worry about it in the past. It was taken away from them. And you can't just magically do that. You need to help them. You need to help them appreciate what it takes to be secure. You need to help them appreciate on how to manage infrastructure. And that is a learning curve. Like I will teach my son over the years to eat healthy, like we need to help these teams understand that. And we can make that easiest by these kind of self-services. And then if they are getting to the point that they fully appreciate it, then perhaps we can take some of these guidances and set it away. But it is an incremental journey. And I found it very hard that we walk around sometimes and say, but this is not agile or this is not DevOps and make them feel bad. No, we need to pick them up where they are. Because you can't just stretch people over what they can appreciate and understand and move with. All right, the third one, cloud. So I love the cloud, right, and the abilities that it gives us. And I only learned this very, very recently, because for a long time I've worked with relatively mature teams and relatively mature DevOps setups, and for them the cloud is fantastic. But if you go into an environment where that is not the case, and you say, okay, we're now moving to the cloud, which means we have everything automated. There's this beautiful saying, I don't know whether you've heard this, but to err is human. If you want to create a catastrophe, you need automation. And that is true, right? Because if you're dealing with infrastructure, and it's manual, it is extremely hard to bring down 1,000 servers. If you're in the cloud, you can do that instantaneous, right? There's whole organizations, you would have heard this in the news, where whole organizations have disappeared overnight because someone blew away their Amazon repository or whatever, right? And the same is true here. So unless you have that appreciation, you don't want to immediately automate everything, because it can be really, really difficult and really bad, because you immediately spin up hundreds of environments, or you destroy them all, right? So it's the same kind of principle that people need to appreciate and learn their capability. I'll give you another analogy. If you're like me, like middle-aged, not as fit as you want to be, you go to a doctor and said, hey, he measures your blood pressure and says, we need to do something. What I want to hear from him is that there's this magic pill that I can take. Take it once, problem solved. And you know what he's going to tell me? Mr. Herring, you have to work out more, you have to eat healthier. I'm like, cool, how long do I have to do this? Really? Yeah, for the rest of your life, right? And that is kind of the same thing here, right? Like, there is no magic cloud that all of a sudden we take it once and problem is solved. No, we're telling teams that they continuously have to do this now, and they have to continuously learn and appreciate that things have to get better. And that's a hard journey, right? They want to just say cloud, right? And all the executives in your organization will have the same, like, we just go cloud, problem solved. It doesn't, right? And what I've learned is that it's a lot better that you allow teams to, in a prescribed way, experiment with the cloud, figure out how these things can look like, let them then describe of how they're using it, the usage patterns, the mechanisms, the processes. You can then have security teams and everyone else kind of crawl over that and have a good look at it. And once you can describe it, then you can automate it. But that takes this huge barrier away from them that they would otherwise have to kind of jump over and potentially be harmful. And I was working at an organization recently. We had a very good cloud team, and they created a cloud landing zone, and the cloud landing zone had CD pipelines and security-proof patterns and all those things. And the only way for a team to spin up an environment for their application was to basically create a Terraform script with all the other components in it. And guess what happened? No one used the cloud because the barrier was just way too high, right? Like, these people have been writing, I don't know, like Siebel code before, and now they needed to learn a new technology, Terraform, they needed to learn a new process, and they needed to worry about everything, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't get it into the cloud. So we need to get a much easier on-ramp for them. And to me, that was really like a humbling moment for myself, because I was well in the camp of like, we're going into the cloud, everything's going to be automated from day one. That's where the benefit is. And so now I'm much more on the like let teams get into it, and then keep improving it. Remember the every day working out and eating healthy, rather than the one blue pill that I give them, and now we're magically in the cloud. And there's one other aspect, and it's perhaps a little bit too techy, that I will just quickly go through this, but if someone wants to have a conversation, I'm going to be around afterwards. And that is about kind of core cloud concepts And there's a lot of argument when you talk to cloud architects about kind of golden images or automation and layers. And the principle is basically, if you think about golden images, think about an immutable container that we move an application into an environment with. And that means once it's created, no one can touch it again. And that sounds great, right? Because that's super secure and like fantastic. The equivalent to that is that you have to build this container every time. So every time you put all the ingredients together, do all the automation, create our application. That sounds complicated. Like, so organizations really want to get to, I want to have this immutable container. The problem is that it's really hard because in your container, if you have a heritage application, you might have all these components, right? There's the infrastructure to worry about, CPU, storage, network, the operating system, the middleware. You have the application, you have the data, you have like the kind of agents that sit on top to make them, to monitor them, to run updates into. And if you have frozen all of that into a golden image, it means when any component changes, I have to change the whole thing. And that is kind of somewhat difficult and heavy to do. So what I really encourage people is to think about the model. If the frozen, immutable container is easy to achieve, go that way. Fantastic. Right? But for many of the applications that you're trying to get into the cloud initially, you will have to do something more incremental that you can see on the right-hand side. Right? You have like a golden image of an operating system, and then you layer into it through automation the rest of the applications. Doesn't sound terribly cloud. That sounds very much like the normal CD pipeline that we used to have in the data center, but it allows you, again, to kind of incrementally get into the cloud and then get better and better at it. All right, so we talked about the 3 rules that I broke. And everything I kind of said, like, I'm a consultant, right? So you know what I'm saying. It depends. That's not super helpful, right? So the boardroom question is always, how do I know that I'm making progress? Because you just told me I can't just follow the guidance of like everything needs to be one or the other or whatever. But you say it's allowed to break it, but how do I know that they're breaking it in the right way? So that is difficult, right? And it's, very often I just use this kind of conscious decision making. If you're breaking rules, but you're doing consciously and you can explain it, it's okay. But there's another way to think about it, and I gave you the hint before, is that you need to make economic decisions. So it's really thinking about, is this thing that we are doing actually worth the investment? Right? So I give you the example of the client that I was working with recently, where they made a huge investment in creating a cloud landing zone. And then as they went kind of through the evaluations, a lot of that fell away. Right? So there was not a lot of applications left that could go into the cloud. So there was a lot of investment, and then there was not a lot of return afterwards. I've seen plenty of test automation frameworks being built very expensively to then be discarded very quickly. So we need to figure out how we can make economic decisions of what investments we make and that they are addressing a specific problem. 10 years ago, I could go into an organization and say Agile and DevOps, and we can do Agile and DevOps transformations, and people would pay money for that. And then we would do this for 3 years, and we had like pipelines and lots of Post-it notes on the wall, and we had Jira, like we are Agile. And then the CIO changes. The new CIO comes in and said, like, so we spent a lot of money in the last 3 years. So what have we achieved? Post-it notes, like we are Agile, like we have pipelines. And he's like, yeah, but what have you achieved? I mean, what do you mean what have we achieved? We are more Agile than before. How do you know? And we couldn't answer these questions because there was such a hype back then that, as long as you did it, you had support, right? Nowadays, and I think like we learned this obviously a few years ago, you need to think about like what are we trying to achieve? How are we going to measure progress? And it's not how many people we've trained. It's not how many Agile teams we have. It is not how many pipelines we have. It is really material stuff to the business. Less defects, faster development into production, reduction of infrastructure cost. If you're not achieving those things, like there's no Agile or DevOps police coming by at the end of the year and giving you a badge. Right? So I think having that economic framework is really, really important. Second thing, like you have to measure things. And you heard this in the keynote, right? Like the analytics coming now from Atlassian will help with that, but there's plenty of other solutions for that as well. And it's not I assume many of you would have heard about the DORA metrics. That's a fantastic, nice set of metrics. It's, however, pretty high level. Like it's very hard to immediately achieve. And as I described earlier, like a lot of the things that we're doing are smaller things, right? They're not immediate enterprise transformation. So I like to work with a balanced scorecard because it allows me to say, well, what is our current problem space? And then we can start thinking about where do we want to make, what do we want to address next? So here are the 4 areas, and I encourage everyone to have something in each of these. Right? So the left top is business effectiveness. The idea here is we want to experiment and expand. So how many experiments can we run? How quickly can we run them? How quickly can we get feedback to know that they're successful? And then we want to expand. Right? We want to put that product out further. We want to expand that feature set. That is what the left top is. The right top is the more traditional DevOps metrics, like speed up and automate. Like, so how much of our automation do we have for testing, for deployment, for spinning up an environment? That's the right top. Left bottom is operations. Right? That is if I have a fantastic service but it's not reliable, no one's going to come back for that. So those are the kind of automate and react. And what I mean by automate and react is, like, one of the measures that I use for operations is how many problems have I found before a customer finds it? Right? So in production, do we actually run synthetic transactions that allows us to see that you can't create an account at the moment, or that you can't order something, or whatever? Right? So that is the operations reliability. And then on the right bottom is the magic dust, the stuff that is really hard to measure. But the dirty secret of DevOps is your architecture matters a lot. If you have a microservice architecture, you're super flexible. If you have a mainframe and SAP in the background, like, they don't move as fast. Like, no matter how much automation you build, they will never move at the same speed. So your architecture matters. And if you've tied your really cool digital front end into a very clunky old mainframe, then you're going to move at the speed of the mainframe. Right? So you have to find a way of decoupling your architecture. And so those measures sit in the right bottom. Very, very crucial, but not as easy to measure. Now, you look at me and like, that sounds all really cool. I can't do anything with that. So I give you a couple of examples at least. So this is one of those money slides. You have the slides available afterwards anyway. But there's examples for this. And this is not the authoritative answer. But these are ideas. Right? So find something in each of these 4 quadrants. And then if you're now investing in cloud, in an agile implementation, in anything that you want, you should find measures in these 4 quadrants that allows you to show progress. Yeah, and sometimes something moves forward and something else moves backwards. That's completely normal for transformations. Yeah, it's the example. Take the example of someone trying to get fit. You have the old thing when you've overtrained, and now you need to take 3 days break. Right? That's normal. All right, so that was the second thing. The first thing, economic decisions. Second thing was measure and show that you are making progress. And now the third ones. So all of these. Sorry, it was meant to say DevOps in the middle. It now says the cave of time. But the thing with options is you provide options because all of these transformations are choose your own adventure. Right? There's no 2 teams that are going through this in the same way. And that's completely normal. But it's really scary when you're an executive. Because you have like all these teams doing like things, everyone is doing it differently. Whoa, right? How are you going to ever manage that and govern it? So you need to provide options, but you need to also provide guidance. Right? So you need to kind of color within these lines, but you can choose any color you like as long as you stay in these lines. Now, there's 2 examples here. When I went to uni many years ago, I learned something. Right? And I went and one of the things that I learned is what you can see there on the left top. Does anyone know what it is on the left top? No. So I played a hell of a lot of computer games when I was in uni. That's from a game called Colonization or Civilization, if you know those. It's called a technology tree, right? And so I remember that when I went to one of my earlier clients, I was like, man, there's so many things that go into DevOps. Like, how could I ever explain to people how these things fits together? And I remember that technology tree from Civilization. The technology tree, what it does is, if you want to be able to do develop a spaceship, before you ever get to spaceship, you need to have language, you need to have math, you need to have science, you need to have metal, right? And so it basically tells you all the things that flow into development. And so we provided the same. On the right-hand side, you see continuous delivery. So that is a technology tree for continuous delivery. The different lines, it's hard to read, but it has like feature toggling, config management, unit testing, deployment, et cetera, et cetera. So it tells you all the things that go into continuous delivery, but each team can fill this tree out as they like. It's their own adventure, right? I start working on config management because that's my biggest problem, and then I go to unit testing. Someone else starts with deployment and goes into to feature toggling. Either way. But I've given them enough guidance that when I go through the teams as a coach, like they can show me, I'm working on this and this and this, and I'm working on this and this and this. And they're all going to work towards the same goal at the end. At the bottom, you have something that I call the Enterprise DevOps bingo card. Again, it gives all the capabilities that we've agreed as an organization that we want to achieve, but each team fills it out differently. Right? So you can see a couple of things in with green tick. Those are the ones we have. The other ones we don't have yet. So that allows you to balance the giving them options, understanding that each team has different problems, but providing enough guidance that they're not going to go off the rails. Right? And that's a dynamic. Like, it keeps swinging back and forth. So let's bring this all together. In the old days, we had transformations that looked like this. Like when I joined Accenture 20 years ago, we did that a lot. Like there's a to be, there's the as is, and now all we need to do is kind of chart the way between those two. Right? That's kind of very typical way of thinking, like where we want to be, come from where we are. Now, there's a couple of interesting challenges with that because the future states keep evolving. Right? Like if you're getting there next year, like, it has moved on. I mean, you would have encountered that when you, like myself, have been in many IT projects. Like, you know, there's an end state defined, and somehow we never get there. Yeah, we never, like, either we lose patience, or the thing has moved on and, you know, been redundant before we made it there. Now, so that means the future state on the right is not terribly well defined for us. The left hand is the as is. Now, that should be easy, right? I mean, we know where we are. Like, we know what capabilities we have. You would be shocked. Like, there's a lot of research out there that when you asked senior leaders in organizations, like what practices and what technologies do you use in your organization, and then you go to the engineers, there's a massive gap between that, right? And that is not, like, it is not the fault of the executives. It's just really complex. I'll give you an example, right? I go into an organization and talk to the team. It's like, do you do continuous integration? And they're like, yeah, we kind of do that. We have, like, we have Jenkins, and like, but you know, we can't really run it all the time because we have these problems with our config management, and our testing is not that great. I get it. Like, so you're kind of there, but not really. And then you have 3 more teams, and they're all different, and they report up to an engineering manager. Now, if you ask the engineering manager, are you using continuous integration? What is he going to say? I was like, no, he's going to say, yeah, kind of. Right? And then he goes to his manager, to the department manager, and then you go to the CIO. At that point, there is only a binary answer. Right? So you lose a lot of information in that transition. That means the people who have to make decisions very often will not have sufficient information about the as-is state to actually really make a call. So you need to enable this at the team level, which I described earlier with these kind of options and guidance. So this is the example. The analogy that I give for this thinking is, in the late 90s, when the internet started to become a real thing, certainly where I was in rural Germany, if you wanted to go to a place that you've never been before, you went on the internet, you went to a mapping website. Right? You entered where you wanted to be, where you came from, and then you printed out like a stack of paper that gave you the instruction how to get there. Have you guys done that? Yeah? And then what happens when you start driving? You get distracted somewhere, right? There's a construction site or something. And then you're lost. Right? Because this whole stack of paper is useless at that point. Right? You have to kind of find your way back onto the thing that you have on paper. My goodness. That is this old thinking of transformation. Right? You're trying to predict all the stuff that could happen, but what you have is a project plan that is printed on paper that as soon as something comes in the way, you can't execute against. Crazy. Right? So what real transformations are, they're like these kind of networky things where you can't really predict. There's this beautiful saying, and I will get it wrong from which country it is, but if you want to cross the river, you do that by touching the stones. Have you guys heard that? And so the idea is that when you're crossing a river, you can't see it, but you're touching where the next stone is. And you take that step, and then you touch again, and you take the next step. That's what transformation is. You don't know where the next step is. You have to figure out what the next step is. And you have to do that until you're on the other side. And it's not a straight line. It's not something you can predict. Right? And that's how transformation works. Right? So what you're giving your teams is a compass. You give them, this is where we want to be. You give them the ability to solve the problems, the challenges along the way by touching the stone, right? By giving them enough guidance for this next step, and then the next, and then the next. Yeah, and that's how you achieve transformation in an organization. That's how you achieve this kind of ongoing, ever-learning organization, because you're not making these huge leaps. You're making small steps, and very conscious steps. And sometimes they take you backwards. Yeah? So I hope that gave you a bit of an idea of why I think breaking the rules sometimes and doing things a bit different to what you can read on the most popular blog post is something that can be right for your organization, as long as you know that you're doing it in the right way. So for me, all the transformations are one step at a time, and in this case, one conscious step at a time. I thank you so much for spending 35 minutes with me. Thank you so much.